You're in the waterloop.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.
Welcome to Waterloop. I'm Travis. Very excited for this episode to be with Earl Swift. Earl, how are you doing?
Doing well, Travis. Thanks for having me.
So the reason I tracked you down is you wrote this book here, Chesapeake Requiem, a year with the Watermen of Vanishing Tangier Island, and it's an incredible book. It really resonated with me because I'm from Maryland. I spent 10 years living in Annapolis. I've worked on the Chesapeake Bay program cleanup effort out of Annapolis in the EPA office, and just love crabs. Can't get enough crab cakes myself. And so it really resonated with me. And I wondered if you could just kind of tell folks that don't know where Tangier Island is, just kind of in a snapshot. What's Tangier Island?
Tangier Island is a squiggle of mud and marsh in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay at the bay's widest point. The bay is about 30 miles wide. It rises imperceptibly from the waters surrounding it. Very low-lying, essentially treeless, and it's populated by 460 men and women. All but a handful of whom can trace their lineage back to the island's original settler, who arrived in 1778. And for the better part of its 240-year history, the island has made its living from the waters of the bay. And that bay now threatens to swallow the island up and erase or bring to an abrupt end that long human habitation there.
So I know you were a longtime reporter with the Virginian Pilot, right? You were a writer for them, and so you probably that's maybe how you crossed paths with Tangier, or it kind of popped onto your radar and it piqued your interest. Is that how it came about, or how did you kind of get the idea to, like, you know what, I want to write a book and learn more about this place?
It came in stages. I didn't wake up one morning burning with curiosity about this odd little island. I guess the first time I really thought about Tangier as a possible story, although I didn't know what that story would be, was in 1994 when the newspaper, the Virginian Pilot, thought it wise to buy me a sea kayak and let me circumnavigate the Chesapeake Bay for 6 weeks.
That's a great assignment.
That was a pretty good assignment. And I guess I was about a week into the trip when I came out of Anancock Creek one morning in the boat and saw offshore a heavily wooded island, pretty small, but substantial enough that it had a really dense pine forest on it. And it was a glassy morning, essentially, windless. And I thought, I'm going to detour over there. My charts told me it was a place called Watts Island, which was uninhabited. So I paddled out to Watts, and about halfway across, the wind came up out of the west, and what had been a glassy morning turned into a pretty serious blow. So it took me 3 hours to cross the 5 miles.
Wow.
Finally got to the island, staggered ashore. And while I was walking the perimeter of the island, looked out to the west, and there was a much more substantial island about 4 miles away with a water tower and a church steeple and clusters of tightly packed houses, all on a wafer of green so thin it looked like the buildings were in the water. And that was my first glimpse of Tangier. It was 5 years later that the paper got around to sending me there for a story. And after that initial 1999 assignment, I got a rapid succession of assignments to go back to the island, and culminating in 2000 in a stay of 6 weeks on and off with a photographer, a guy named Ian Martin. And the subjects of our stories while we were there varied, but that 6-week trip was concentrated pretty specifically on the terrible irony that this island that had depended on the bay for its sustenance for, at that point, 8 generations, was now looking at its own demise at at those very same waters were threatening to bring its end. And so that's kind of a brief thumbnail. After that 2000 trip, I left and I didn't come back. I got busy with other stories, started writing books, got involved in a succession of time-consuming projects, and always kind of had Tangier in the back of my mind as a place to revisit, but never got around to it. Eventually, my house in Norfolk, which was close to the water, started flooding, worse with each successive astronomical high tide or northeaster. And I remember I was thigh deep in water in my basement trying to get the sump pump to kick on during one northeaster. And it occurred to me, God, if it's this bad in Norfolk, it's got to be pretty dire out on Little Tangier. And that kind of planted the seed that I'd eventually go back. My fiance, Amy, really I have to credit her with getting me to turn that inclination into action in the fall of 2015 when I was looking around for a new book project. She said, well, you've been talking about Tangier for a long time. Why don't you go back there and see what's happening? And so I did. And on returning was astounded at how much change there had come since 2000.
So you say, it's written here in the thing, Vanishing Island. You mentioned that, it's getting swallowed up by the bay. A big part of your work here explores the forces that are responsible, and that's a big struggle that the residents there are go through. Is this what are the causes? And it seems they feel like it's just erosion, right? But we know that there's the climate change aspect as well. So what's, from the science perspective, from all the people you've talked to, what are the forces that are swallowing Tangier?
Well, the island's suffering from a diabolical 1-2 punch, really. It's the lower Chesapeake has some of the highest relative sea level rise on Earth, and that word relative is important because in the Chesapeake, not only do you have the water slowly coming up, but at an increasingly fast rate, but you have the land actually subsiding, and that's a byproduct of the last ice age. If you picture the Earth's crust as like a waterbed, for lack of a better.
Okay.
And you picture the ice sheets that covered most of North America back, 15,000 years ago, 15 to 21,000 years ago, as a heavy book placed on that waterbed. The Earth's surface beneath that ice was pressed downward, and the crust was, and beneath the crust is the mantle, which comprises most of the Earth's mass. A portion of that mantle is viscoelastic, meaning it's goopy, it's gel-like, and when compressed, behaves like a gel is prone to do. It squirts away from the point of compression. So what you saw was that where the ice was heaviest, up in what's now subarctic Quebec, the ice there was 2 feet thick, and it pressed down on the crust, which compressed the mantle, which forced some of that viscoelastic mantle away from the leading edge of the ice sheet, which pushed it right into what's now the mid-Atlantic states of the United States. And some of the greatest resulting bulge, the Earth's crust had to lift to make room for this new mantle, was pretty much right where you find Tangier today. So 11,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, the bay was high and dry. It was much higher than it is today. Because there was so much water locked up in ice sheets, there was a lot less ocean than there is today. And so the bay was a long way from the Atlantic. And it was essentially just a river valley, the lower Susquehanna, into which a bunch of tributary streams that we now know, as the Nanticoke, the Pocomoke, the Potomac, the James, the York, the Rappahannock all flowed. But it was far less watery than it is, and so what's happening is, the about 11,000 years ago, the ice age ended. The ice sheets melted. That ground up in subarctic Quebec that had been so compressed began to rebound, and as it rebounded, all of the displaced mantle that had been shoved southward started to ooze its way back home, and so the ground in the mid-Atlantic that had been lifted so high began to subside, and that's been going on for thousands of years and will continue for thousands more. The upshot of which is the ground is falling at about the same rate that the water is rising in the lower Chesapeake, and so you have essentially double the problem.
Yeah,
and Tangier has no elevation to give up. It's a very low-lying place where the highest point of land in the island is barely 5 feet, and that's just a solitary knob. Most of the island fails to clear 3 feet. And actually, the bulk of it being salt marsh, probably 75% of the island is salt marsh, floods twice a day. It fails to clear 1 foot. So this is a pretty amphibious place to live.
Yeah. So the people there, you mentioned 8 generations they go back. They've really been, and this is another beautiful part of the book, they're used to seeing some of that erosion or some of that subsidence. They're used to seeing parts of the island, parts of the marshes kind of disappearing underwater over time. But I think that they've seen that accelerate the past few decades, which is really due to the sea level rise part of it kind of increasing.
Well, you've got, what's much has been made of the fact that Tangiermen, being a conservative bunch and a kind of a literalist Christian bunch, don't much cotton to the scientific explanation for what's happening. They, for generations, have noticed Tangier getting smaller. And in fact, since 1850, the island has lost 2/3 of its area. And they'll tell you that the phenomenon of land loss began in the Chesapeake long before anyone was talking about climate change, which is true enough. I mean, people have been talking about it for, since the Civil War, pretty much. What's interesting, though, is that, or what's at the heart of their skepticism, I think, is just that they rely on a very anecdotal style of data collection. They go out in their boats every day and they look at the water, and that doesn't yield a ready measure for what's unfolding before their eyes. It's really slow. It's really subtle. This is an island that doesn't have hard edges. It's a marsh island, so it's not as if you have a yardstick against which you can easily measure the water rising or falling. It just drowns marsh, and the marsh slowly converts to open water. And you really don't, it's not a dramatic process day to day. Over the decades, it's incredibly dramatic, but it's a sneak up on you kind of problem that they have there. Mm-hmm. And it isn't until you get above the island, go up in a helicopter or a plane, look down on it, compare what you're seeing with photos taken just a few years ago. And you can see that not only is Tangier becoming smaller around its edges, being chipped away, around its perimeter, but it's essentially dissolving from the inside out as well. What had been, high and dry land, of which there's very little to begin with, is slowly converting to marsh. What had been marsh is slowly converting to mud flat and open water. And so the island has become much more soupy. When I was there in 2000, the high tides brought the water up out of the marsh and over the roads and up, around the perimeter of the island. What you see them doing now is bringing water straight up through the ground. It just percolates right up into people's yards.
Wow.
So it's just become far more porous. What had been fairly solid wetland is now a loose macrame, dotted with pools of water. It looks like lace from the air.
Wow. And they, I think in the book, they talk about, the waves, right? The wave action being part of what's taking the land away.
Sure.
So not even talking about this subsidence, definitely not talking about climate change, but the wave action, being a big factor for why it's gone.
And certainly it is. I mean, there's no doubt that wind-driven waves, especially from the west, have been especially rough on the island's shoreline. But those waves have gotten worse over the last century for a reason. This is not a steady erosion that doesn't change. This, if you were to chart it, it's not a straight diagonal curve across, diagonal line across the chart. This is a parabolic curve. It's gotten a lot worse as time has gone on. So if you look back in the in the 18th century, when the island was first settled, there was a little bit of erosion on the west side because you've got a lot of fetch, what mariners call fetch, a lot of open water susceptible to wave buildup. You have a lot of winds from the west in both summer and winter. The predominant winter winds are from the northwest. You've got 20 miles or more of fetch to the northwest. You've got 30, 40, maybe even 50 miles of fetch to the southwest. So a lot of room for wave action to build up. And so I have no doubt that in the 18th century, they were losing land. They were not losing. But what you see when you chart land loss in the Chesapeake over time, and a number of academic studies have remarked on this, is that mid-19th century, right around 1850, there is a point of inflection where something changed, where what had been slow and very incremental erosion suddenly started to tick up, and it really started to accelerate. And it's at that point that many of the islands, and there used to be 40 or more of them in the Chesapeake that were inhabited, began to lose population. That's when people recognized that they weren't long for the world where they were, and they started to make for the mainland. And there are a host of islands that have storied names around the Chesapeake, and lost communities: Holland Island, James Island, Sharp's Island, or dozens. That process has continued to accelerate. Throughout the 20th century, it began moving at a gallop, and now it's moving at a breakneck pace. So yeah, Tangiermen do ascribe their problem to erosion, simple erosion, and nothing more. And erosion may be the single biggest symptom of what's occurring, but erosion is not divisible from the forces that are propelling it.
Yeah.
Erosion is not a separate and distinct problem from climate change. They're all part of a bundle.
Yeah. And, the people there, I'd like to kind of follow up on that as far as what their reaction is, what their position is. We live in this country and society where there is, the climate change denial phenomenon going on, where people don't want to believe this science. And I know that the people there on Tangier kind of align with that thinking. So what is their reaction when people try to explain the science of climate change and sea level rise?
I think that they're a bit frustrated by the insistence of those of us on the outside to keep on coming back to that subject, because I think they're now at the point where they don't care what's causing it. And really, it's easy to understand how really doesn't matter at this point. What we have is a slow motion natural disaster that's getting less slow motion all the time, and it's a bit of an academic argument as to whether it's erosion or sea level rise that's bringing it about. The fact is, they need help. They need it. If they're going to get it, they need it now.
Yeah.
And so I think they're a bit frustrated by the debate itself.
Regardless of the cause, this is what's happening to their land, to their home, what's been their home for generations, and their livelihoods. And so what's gonna happen here? So
I think the population is not lockstep in its view towards climate change and denying it necessarily. There are some folks who flat out don't buy it, see this strictly in terms of erosion. There are some folks who acknowledge that climate change, they can see the signs that it's occurring. They can see sea level rise, but they do not buy the notion that there's a human, that man's hand plays a role in it. Tangier is as I mentioned before, a biblically literalist. It's pretty close to a theocracy of old school Christians, and most of them raised as old school Methodists. And when I say old school, I mean old school. This is not your mainland Methodism. And so they see the natural world as divine and as something that we puny humans are incapable of really messing with. This is a work of God, and we lack the wherewithal to mess with it, but so much, and so that's kind of at the heart of the skepticism on Tangier, I think.
Well, you spent a lot of time there, and you spent a lot of time with a number of these individuals, right? And a lot of time, got very close to them, and friends with them. So, what's it like? Becoming good friends with the person, spending a lot of time with them, having a lot of respect for them, knowing that they're incredible people. The watermen, these are watermen that have a great knowledge of the water, and they're good people. So, yeah, what's it like then, having them not kind of be willing to embrace science on this, or just not kind of open their mind to that?
Well, I mean, I disagreed with them, and they knew it.
Okay.
We neither they nor me nor I ever attempted to mask our rather divergent views, but you hit the nail on the head. There are people who live a tough and enviable in many ways life, whom I really did come to respect and admire over my time on Tangier, and many of whom I consider friends, and will for the rest of my life, I'm sure. Yeah. We were able to get past any disagreements we had, because they didn't matter to what created, the bond between us in the first place. And I think it is possible to differ politically, stridently, with someone, and not demonize them. It's something that we as a country kind of losing some grip on, but I think it's important to be able to see people as people, and not as just a bundle of political stands. And so that Tangiermen who live in and depend on this water to a degree that most of us can't even imagine, choose to disagree with the scientific community on what's causing that water to become threatening to them, is it's a curiosity. It's part of what makes the story compelling. But in the end, it's also a bit of a who cares, because what really matters is that they are out there on the water. They are threatened by the very water that has sustained them now, and that what's causing that terribly ironic dilemma is almost beside the point.
Yeah.
Except once you're away from Tangier, you recognize that this is the canary in the coal mine, and that we're soon to have this situation replayed hundreds, if not thousands of times, just on the American coastline.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another awesome thing about the book, and the fact you went to Tangier, is this is kind of a leading edge of climate change really impacting a community, a neighborhood in America. I mean, there's been places where these big hurricanes have come and hit, and they've been fueled by climate change. You've got some communities in Alaska, right, where they're having to move folks. But I mean, it doesn't really get any more frontline than Tangier Island when it comes to climate impacts. I wanted to ask you more about the Waterman side of this, because you spent time there, the Bay. I know Chesapeake Bay, but not everybody that might be listening or watching this really knows about the Watermen of Chesapeake Bay. So could you and they're a special breed, right? And so if you could kind of describe for folks what a Chesapeake Bay waterman is, especially the ones that are really out there on Tangier, the other islands, and so forth.
Yeah. Well, the phrase waterman, which you really don't hear outside of the Chesapeake, refers to a person, man or woman, who makes his or her living fishing up more than one kind of seafood. So in the case of Tangier, the economy's long been sustained by the Chesapeake Bay blue crab in the summer, oysters in the winter, and for some islanders, fish kind of the year round, depending on what's running. And so you've got a fleet on Tangier of very small boats, some wood, some glass, probably most wood still at this point, that range in size from 20 to 45 feet, say. So we're talking little boats. They're crewed by one or two people. And these boats go out, leave the harbor every morning well before dawn, hours before dawn, and either pull up crab pots, which are, despite the name, not pots at all. They're cubic,
like a cage,
wire mesh cubes. Yeah, about 2 feet to a side. It's a trap, and crabs can swim into them, but can't easily find their way back out. And depending on what kind of crabber you are, either a hard crabber who fishes up the kind of crabs that you would have at a backyard crab boil, say, or whose meat winds up in the region's famed crab cakes. That person goes out and is just trying to catch as many crabs as possible. He's allowed to catch up to 47 bushels a day of crabs. Or you're a peeler crabber, and in that case, you fish up far fewer crabs. You catch far fewer. And what you're looking for is a crab about to molt, about to go to shed its exoskeleton, which it must do, like many insect species, in order to grow. And if you snatch a newly molted crab out of the water within a few hours, its new shell will not harden, and you wind up with soft shell crab, a delicacy up and down the East Coast. So those two kinds of crabbers are at work on Tangier in the summer, and the season generally goes from mid-March until early October, and as soon as it's over, then Tangiermen take those same boats and re-rig them for oyster dredging, and they go out on the wild oyster rocks all up and down the Chesapeake, and they dredge. They drag what looks like a lawnmower bag along the bottom, and scoop up tons of oysters and dump them out on deck, and then pick through them, find pick the good shells, the good oysters from the empty shells, and throw the detritus back overboard. And those two fisheries sustain the island's economy, along with a little bit of tourism. The Chesapeake is it's an unusual body of water. It's both big and intimate because it's 200 miles north to south, and about 30 miles wide at its widest point. So there are relatively few places in the bay. You got to get way down into the lower bay before you reach that point where you can't see land on the other side. Especially if you're in a boat in the middle of the bay. But and it's a relatively shallow body of water. It averages 21 feet deep. But all of that makes it a particularly challenging place to work on the water because shallow water builds waves very quickly. The winds, the bay shape is almost perfectly engineered to guarantee that waves will build. And so you have the weather can turn from slick cam, as they say on Tangier, which is glassy smooth, to 4 or 5 foot seas in the space of a couple of hours. It can come up fast, and these guys are in little boats. These are not the big deadliest catch kind of crabbing boats that you're used to seeing on TV. These are Chesapeake Bay dead rises and barcats, which are age-old designs.
Yeah, you've got a great, drawing of one on the cover there. People can see
it's a photo of a Tangierman in a barcat. And he's doing something unusual in that he's crab potting in a barcat, which you don't see many people do. But so it's a very small boat for that.
Very low sides, right? So they can pull those pots out and everything.
That's right. Yeah, it's arranged so that the bow is up high and can cut through waves, but the stern is super low, so you don't have to pull a pot up. You're pulling 100. You're pulling, if you have a big license, 425 pots up a day, and extra foot of freeboard if you at a higher stern would take its toll on you.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's the book is it's very much a story about I mean the crabs play a central role here in the story. The crabs and the oysters, right? It's kind of, you've got Tangier Island, you have these people, you have the crabs, the oysters, the bay, the water, and it's all this very obviously symbiotic relationship. And I just, again, as being from that area, loved the deep dive into all those specific parts of it. Like you learn a ton about crabs if if you didn't know that already. So it gives you a whole new appreciation. I imagine you learned a ton about crabs out there doing this.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was pretty ignorant going in, and so every day was going to school for me. It was fantastic.
Yeah, and I mean, there's always big headlines every year about how's the health of the Chesapeake Bay, the blue crab population this year. How are they doing compared to where the scientists want them to be? And I think they've done a pretty good job managing the restrictions to where it's a sustainable population at the moment. I'm putting question marks on the end of all these. I like to hear what you have to say. Of course, a lot of the watermen want to have less restrictions. They want to be able to go do more. But it seems like the fishery is being managed in a way that's got some stability and reliability to the population.
Yeah, for I think that charted over in terms of trends, that's definitely true. The Virginia's lagged behind Maryland in regulations traditionally. It's been slow to declare moratoriums on parts of the bay and outlaw certain types of crabbing, for instance, that Maryland's been down with for a long time. But they're both pretty much in sync now, and so you see generally a much healthier crab population than you did, say, back in the 80s to mid 90s, when there were times when the species seemed poised at the brink of extinction. The crab. It was a scary time, and you had, especially the female, the sook population had disappeared, and one of the weird just facts about the blue crab is that because of its migratory patterns, most of the crabs caught in Maryland waters are males or jimmies, and most of the crabs, 75% or better caught in Virginia waters are females. So you've got this strange difference, geographic difference in what's being caught. But generally speaking, the crab's holding its own. The last few years have been really good for the crabbers. Part of that is that the state's making sure that everybody's a lot more careful about how and where they catch the crabs, I think. And part of that may be a simple function of the fact that there are fewer crabbers. Each year there are fewer crabbers. Tangier and Smith Island, Maryland, are the only two inhabited islands, offshore islands left in the Chesapeake at this point. Both used to be 100% devoted to crabbing. Tangier pretty much still is. Smith, there are no crabbers left. They're a handful.
Wow.
The population there is bottomed out. Total population on Smith now is 250, down 1,400 in the 30s. So it's about half the size of Tangier and falling fast. You've got crabbing communities all around the edge of the bay that have seen their veterans die off or retire, and the mantle has not been picked up by a new generation. Mm-hmm. And in Tangier, you see the same thing happening. I mean, you've got a population in free fall, partly because the young people there have watched their fathers break their backs every day on what's an uncertain and dangerous line of work. And at least since satellite TV arrived on the island, they've come to see, there are a lot easier ways to make a living, or mainland. And so with rare exceptions, on graduating from the K through 12 school on Tangier, kids decamp for the military or for college, and they don't come back. So the best friend to the Chesapeake Bay blue crab may over time prove to be the slow die out of people willing to catch them.
Interesting. That'll be interesting to see because there's still a great demand, I think, for crab. People love it.
But that sadly, Travis, that demand is being met even at some restaurants that build themselves as inexorably linked to the bay, to the Chesapeake culture. That demand is being met with farm crab meat, pasteurized crab meat that's being imported. And in fact, it is. You go in the grocery store and look this summer at what's for sale in the refrigerated meat locker of your local supermarket. Examine the packaging very closely. You'd swear at first glance that it's straight from the Chesapeake Bay. You got to read the fine print to realize, no, it's from the Philippines or it's from Vietnam.
I was gonna say, yeah, a lot from Southeast Asia, right? Yeah, true.
We'll continue to eat crab. Now, it doesn't taste anything like the Chesapeake Bay blue crab. And folks from Maryland and Virginia who know how blue crab ought to taste and how crab cake ought to taste will be able to tell the difference immediately. But most tourists to Baltimore, for instance, they go to a restaurant, they have no idea how it's supposed to taste. And with pasteurized crab, it's better than just about anything else. I mean,
sure.
It's not that tangy, sweet, that weird combination that a Chesapeake Bay blue crab brings to the table.
Mm-hmm. The other critter there, the oysters. The oyster population is, I think, like at 1% of its historic high in the Chesapeake Bay. I think there's some success stories in little pockets along some different rivers, the Rappahannock, where they're successfully kind of getting the oysters going, and they're doing some nice sales to restaurants, and they're getting pretty popular. But what about the folks on Tangier and getting oysters? I mean, I think that's not the same situation population wise as the crab.
No, back in the 80s, early 90s, into the early aughts of the new century, the oyster appeared to be pretty much done in the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, it had been notoriously overfished through the 19th and first half of the 20th century. I mean, brutally overfished.
Mm-hmm.
The rock scraped barren, nothing left. It was a slash and burn approach to fishery. And on top of that, right behind that overfishing, you had the introduction of two parasites into the two diseases of the oyster that pretty much finished what man had started. You had something that was called MSX, the X because for years scientists couldn't figure out what the heck it was, and you had something that's been nicknamed dermo, and they're both nasty little microscopic beasties that just eventually kill the oyster, but they also render its meat very unpalatable. You wouldn't want to eat an oyster that's infected. And then, the rate of infection on Virginia rocks was like 96%.
Wow.
Back in the late 90s. It was terrible. And it didn't seem possible that the species could bounce back. But through incredible management, and you got to give the Virginia Marine Resources Commission and its scientific associates real credit here. They limited public access to the rocks. They gave the species time to develop resistance to the parasite problem, and the oyster is back not only in the Rappahannock but out in the open bay. I went out oystering on a couple of rocks, and oysters are big and healthy and delicious, and thankfully for the oyster, you've got relatively few watermen out there trying to harvest them. Aquaculture has become a business. A lot of oysters now are farmed, but in terms of going for the wild oyster, you have fewer watermen to begin with, and then you've got the fact that whereas a waterman can go out, especially a peeler crabber, in his boat and fish for crab by himself, to go oystering, you need a minimum of 2 people aboard the boat. So you've got fewer boats in the water. You have the same number of men occupying fewer boats, and so that limits how much damage that population of watermen can do from year to year. And the state's very strict about giving each rock 1 or 2 years of rest between seasons at which people have access to it. And so far, so good. It's a fishery that everyone wrote off as gone for good is now actually producing a significant portion of the average Tangier waterman's income each year. So, and that's just
great.
the last 4 years. I mean, it's very recent.
Yeah. I mean, the oysters have such filtering capacity that if they could really bounce back and were managed in the right way, they could be a great force for cleaning up that water in the bay.
Yeah. I'm not sure what they do with nitrogen, but
yeah. Clarity at least. A couple other questions here. So, going back to your time on the island, how much time did you actually spend living on the island?
I was there for 14 months.
14 months.
Just
from a personal perspective, what was that like? Taking a good chunk of your life and living in this place.
It was wonderful, really. I mean, I miss the pace of my days there. I miss the simplicity of my days there. I mean, there's no cell phone service. Nobody drives a car. You get around on a bicycle or scooter or golf cart. I went everywhere by bike. And what I miss most about it, I think, is that because there's no cell phone service, almost every contact, every transaction you have with another human being is face-to-face. And so most of your contacts occur serendipitously. You're out on the road going someplace, you run into somebody you stop and you talk, and that's how your day goes. That's how your contacts are made. And I just found that really very easy to adapt as a lifestyle. There's an authenticity to it that I really came to love.
Yeah.
And I'm back on, here we are talking on Skype, and I'm on my cell phone hours each day, and I do miss the in-person immediacy of the place. And they're wonderful people. And it's nice to be able to decipher their accent over time. They've got a famed accent that, to an untuned ear, can be very tough to parse. And so added to that was the longer I was there, the easier I was able to actually communicate. It's nice.
The accent, and also just different expressions and words for things and phrases. So you throw that in there, and it's like another language.
It is. And if you were to listen to 2 Tangiermen talking on marine radio, say, where they're not worried about having to make themselves understood to an outsider, good luck picking two words out of 10.
Yeah.
Layered on top of that, and the old words and phrases, is the Tangier tendency to say exactly the opposite of what you mean. So you may be able over time to figure out what the words are, but then get the meaning completely wrong.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I definitely can see the beauty in that simpler life, right? The less digital life, the more outdoors life, the more human contact, less of this hustle and bustle and crazy stuff, and just kind of living with simpler priorities. Sounds awesome. So what is going to happen to the island here? We know what nature will do, but is there any reality that the government's going to step in and build a seawall or do something like that? One of the lines that jumped out at me in the book is like, they said, somebody said, we don't care if ISIS comes and builds a wall. We just want a seawall built around our island to save this place. But what's the reality of something like that happening?
That was Lottie Moore who said that. You've got a declining population. Head count's now about 460. The best estimate, and this is strictly a wild ballpark estimate from the Corps of Engineers, to rebuild the island in the style that would buy it the time it's looking for. You're looking at a price tag of $800 million, probably, and up. So, that comes to roughly, $2 million a head. So the question, you've got a couple of questions you have to mull. Number one, as a prospect for saving a community, is this good precedent to spend that kind of money saving Tangier? Because again, we're going to be facing this situation hundreds, if not thousands of times in the very few decades to come. Next 20 years, the situation is going to be replayed elsewhere. And I don't know the answer for that question. I know I would love to see Tangier saved, but I think that we have to develop before we decide to do it, we have to develop a rubric, a methodology for deciding, okay, what towns are we going to save and which are we going to surrender, because we cannot save them all. That's a given. We don't have the money, we don't have the time, we don't have the technology, and so we're going to walk away from some. So while I'd love to see this unique little piece of Americana saved, I think that rubric is the first step. We have to do that. Could it be saved? Yes. Sure. I mean, the Corps of Engineers and the state of Maryland are investing hundreds of millions of dollars, even as we speak, in restoring Poplar Island, which is an uninhabited island, once inhabited, but will be uninhabited from this point going forward, up in the Middle Bay. And when that project is finished, Poplar will be returned to about the dimensions it had during the Civil War. Before the project was undertaken in the mid-90s, Poplar had dwindled to, I think, less than 5 acres. It was just a tiny little wisp of a marsh. And what the state and the feds will get out of that investment is habitat. So it won't be a home for people. It'll be a habitat for migratory waterfowl, marine wildlife. Now, there is a possibility that even if Tangier were judged a bad deal in terms of a town to save, that its value as habitat could propel a project to save it, or at least save something. It may not save the town, but it could save over time the island, because we've lost a lot of island habitat in the Chesapeake over the last century, and this is a pretty, as pieces go, this is a big piece, and it is not only a landing spot for birds, but it creates a lee in which underwater grasses can grow and flourish. And without those underwater grasses, of course, all manner of marine species, most notably the blue crab, can't flourish. And so, you lose Tangier, you're not only losing 275 houses and homes for 460 people, you're losing, in kind of a cascading failure, the homes for all sorts of other animals as well, animals that we hold pretty dear. So you look at it, you take away the human element, look at it in terms of habitat for wildlife. Oddly, it may be easier to justify that kind of expense.
And I can imagine the reaction of Tangier residents to, they see this island up north getting built up for birds, and here their island for people is disappearing. They don't take kindly to that.
They don't. You want to get Tangiermen excited, just say 2 words: Poplar Island.
And man, management of the Chesapeake Bay is an incredible challenge. It's complex. It involves so many entities and so many issues, and it's incredible. I just learned a ton more talking to you about this. So, last question is, your book came out last year, I think.
August 7th.
Okay. And I know you've done some much higher profile interviews than this one, but what's kind of been your reaction? What's been the main points of interest and so forth to your book?
Well, it seems to resonate with readers in kind of concentric circles. You've got the immediate interest in the Chesapeake, and so it's achieved some pretty good traction around the bay itself. Then you've got the wider interest in climate change and the portent of disaster that this little town represents. I think the most the reaction that I guess I had the greatest trepidation about was on Tangier itself, because I knew full well that pretty much every islander was going to be reading the book. Yes. And I also had resolved that the first place I would do a reading of the book would be on Tangier after the book came out. So 4 days after it was published, by which time a significant portion of the population had already torn through it, I went back with my fiance to Tangier, and my daughter was a little worried about me going because she thought it was going to end like The Wicker Man. But I got back onto the island and did a reading, and then did a Q&A session. And this was all in the school's auditorium on the same night that a very prominent and popular boat captain was having a birthday party, and so I got a great turnout on a night I shouldn't have expected to have anyone show up, and I was very happy about that. We got to the Q&A, and instead of asking questions, one Tangierman after another stood up and kind of offered testimony about me and the book, or about Amy. It was almost like being in church, and there were tears shed. It was incredibly moving and wonderfully gratifying, and kind of an electric moment. And so it doesn't get better than that. I mean, the book's achieved. Critics have been more generous they've been generous beyond my dreams. But I think that was the single most amazing moment of post-publication life that I've had, was being there in that school auditorium.
I can understand that. I was just really blown away when I read it. Being a Maryland native, spending so much time around the bay, working in the environmental restoration side of things, being such a fan, having such a love for the Chesapeake Bay, the depth that you went to, and the color and life that you bring to it all. I really appreciate the book a lot, and I enjoy it a lot. So I'm glad for the opportunity to talk to you, and appreciate your time talking to me today.
Well, thank you so much, Travis. I appreciate it. I'm right back at you.
Yeah.
Fun to talk about.
You're in the waterloop. Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.